Hello, this is AstrologyNewsReport.com with your hosts, David Anton Savage and Ron Berger.
Now we go to our third segment of this week's report, People in the News, where we will analyze the Vedic astrology birth chart of a newsworthy person, place, or event.
This week, we've decided to compare the birth charts of Oscar Pistorius and Reeva Steenkamp to see if we can't sort out some things using Vedic astrology, since Mr. Pistorius is on trial for having shot Ms. Steenkamp to death.
And sad to say, it is certain that these two souls had some tragically fatal destiny that they shared through their relationship.
But we caution our listeners to keep in mind that our opinions on this matter are a bit speculative due to the fact that neither person has a published birth time which has been verified.
All right, for him, we do have some decent information on an approximate time of birth based on the recollections of a near relative.
Oscar Pistorius was born on November 22nd, 1986, in Johannesburg, South Africa, and we are using an 11:30 a.m. birth time for his chart.
For Ms. Steenkamp, we had to use what little we do know about her to cast a plausible chart. She was very beautiful, had a public life with a successful career as a model, as well as some work in television, and she had brains to match her looks. She graduated from law school in 2005.
So the chart has to make some sense based on some basics and must show a connection between herself and Oscar.
Reeva Steenkamp was born on August 19, 1983 in Cape Town, South Africa, and we are using a birth time of 8:20 a.m., making her a Leo rising.
So let's proceed with the analysis of their relationship. What happened on that ill-fated night, and where Mr. Pistorius is headed next.
We also have the astrology chart of the time of the event, which took place in the early morning hours of February 14, 2013.
So, looking at each of their charts briefly, we see Mr. Pistorius has Mars in the first house of self, which gives him passion and a drive to succeed, but it also makes him quite a hothead, prone to rash actions like pulling guns in public, which he has done on more than one occasion.
Then all you have to do is see his Sun-Saturn conjunction in his 10th house, and that's a red flag for a control-freak dictator type of personality.
The Mars-Saturn Pariyavatana Yoga, ruler of the first in exchange with ruler of the 10th, is what guarantees him fame in his life.
Then you take a look at Reeva's chart and you see a very powerful and capable woman with a healthy ego and plenty of talent. The ruler of the first house of self and ego, the Sun, is in the first house. And the Sun, being the planet of power in Leo, it's the sign of royalty.
Venus, as the ruler of the 10th house of public actions and career, is in the first house of self as well. Venus, of course, also signifies beauty, and she was a model.
She has Saturn, ruler of the 6th house of defense and litigation, exalted in her 3rd house of prowess. She's quite good at defending herself. She would have made a formidable lawyer. Unfortunately, those skills and abilities do not protect anyone from bullets coming through a closed door.
Comparing the two charts, right away you see that their rising signs line up across from one another along the 1-7 axis of self versus partner. This sets up energy for a relationship.
And each of them are coming into a relationship with their own intense, powerful, and dynamic charts. Neither soul is a lightweight by any stretch of the imagination. It was always going to be a volatile combination.
What else can we find when we overlay these two charts to get more clues?
Mr. Pistorius has his moon, the emotional mind, powerful in its own sign Cancer, signifying strong feelings, but as ruler of the 6th house of defense, struggle, and enemies in the 6th house of his chart.
This goes a long way to explain why he may have felt insecure or unsafe in a world full of potential enemies, and why he kept guns around so he could defend himself.
Yes, David. Placement of the moon has a lot to say about how a person views life and how they feel about it. If the moon is strong in a chart, it makes that person highly reactive.
When you look at her chart, you see that Mars is in its sign of debilitation, Cancer, in the 12th house. The planet of violence in the 12th house of the subconscious and hidden actions is a scary feature for her chart, indicating her own potential for losing it.
And then, laying one chart over the other, you see that his 6th house lord, the moon, is in a near-perfect conjunction with her debilitated Mars, less than 30 minutes of arc from exact. This is a very bad combination for a relationship. It gives excitement, but also emotional turmoil at the very least, and even could descend to emotional violence.
Now we move on to the day of the tragedy, February 14th, 2013, approximately at 4 a.m. What were their planetary periods at the time of the event, and what transits were influencing their natal charts?
Oscar Pistorius had entered his K2 major period in late 2012.
K2 is the most unpredictable factor in Vedic astrology. It is the twitching tail of the demon dragon, activating the mysterious past life karma, which must now be resolved. It signifies for chaos and can unhinge all in its wake.
And quite ominously for him, his natal K2 is in the most difficult house of all, the 8th house of chronic problems and humiliation. The 8th house is sometimes referred to as the house of the executioner because it is the house of death.
With his 8th house lit up due to his K2 period, it did not bode well to have his powerfully placed Mars in the 1st house aspecting his 8th house. His natal Mars aspect on his 8th house shows that the past life karma is ripe to explode.
The transits to his ascendant on the night in question were adding way too much juice for him to be able to remain calm and reasonable when under stress. Note that there are 4 planets transiting through Aquarius, his 1st house of self.
Egoic Sun, delusional Neptune, explosive Mars, and a suggestible Mercury, the planet of judgment, were all transiting in his 1st house, and all simultaneously influencing his natal Mars.
Not a good setup for either party to engage in a heated argument. You're not going to work something out in your relationship with those transits in play.
Meanwhile, in Reeva's chart, those same planets were transiting in her 7th house, opposite to and aspecting her 1st house of self and body.
Although it appears that Miss Steenkamp does not really have the setup in her chart to be a murder victim, it must be stated again, as we've said before, individual karma can be trumped by circumstantial karma.
Even though you do not have the karma to die violently, that doesn't mean you should be near to someone who has a violent temper, owns a gun, and is very upset.
Although it must be noted that Reeva Steenkamp was running her moon period at the time of her death, and for her this timing is fraught with serious problems and is not without danger.
Though she has a well-placed moon in the positive 5th house, the moon major period lights up her 12th house of endings and unknowns, where she has her debilitated Mars in Cancer. The moon period had therefore set her up for a potentially unknown violent event.
So then we look at the sub-period ruler, which does portend foreseeing the results of the major period. And here again we see that her Saturn, which although it is well placed and exalted, does activate the 6th house of accidents and enemies, as well as the 7th house of the partner. The general rule, though, is that if 2 of the bad Dusthana houses, such as the 6th and the 12th house, are simultaneously activated, and there's a natural malefic planet, in this case Mars, involved, that there is danger to the person.
And now add in that rather problematic group of transiting planets, and we have a recipe for tragic events.
Okay, let's move on to the outcome of the trial. Will Mr. Pistorius be found guilty or innocent? If found guilty, will he spend a long time in prison? He was, at the very least, criminally negligent in the discharge of a firearm, Now they are saying it's at least a case of culpable homicide.
If we have his birth time right, then at this time, during the trial, he is in a Venus subperiod. Venus is a favorable planet for Aquarius charts. It is the ruler of the 9th house of good fortune in its own sign and house. It might be able to rescue him.
But when we look at the transits, we see retrograde Mars now afflicting his natal Ketu, the major period ruler, in his 8th house.
And a retrograde Saturn and Rahu in his 9th house of law and destiny, both which will still be there until Rahu leaves in mid-July.
By which time Mars will move into Libra, that giving him 2 natural malefics transiting in his 9th house of law and destiny.
And get this, using the Ashtagavarga system, the system that rates transits for benefic or malefic effects, both Mars and Saturn get 0 points when transiting in his 9th house. In other words, the worst possible rating.
Well, I guess that cinches it. Even if the judgment is put off until July or August, it looks like he's condemned to the fullest punishment that South Africa has to offer.
Yep, we'll be watching that carefully over the next couple of months.
And we will report back and see just how all this astrological prognostication works out.
Thanks for visiting astrologynewsreport.com.